Hello, my name is Chris Hager, and I want to share a presentation with you today called CIA versus God. How do you save the world? And the presentation is based on my experience as a government worker and as a civilian employee and traveling about the world and seeing how the CIA tries to influence the world to try to save the world, and also as a Christian, being baptized at a young age, looking at it from a Christian standpoint of how can we save the world. And I just want to share some things that I feel like God has put on my heart to relate to you about some of my experiences. And so I started out with the CIA, and this is a young Chris Hager standing on the Khyber Pass, which is a main entryway and cross point between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And while I was there, I was part of the CIA at that time. And as a disclaimer, I kind of have to give you an explanation of how we're going to do things here during these presentations. So while I was at the agency, I was undercover, and during that time frame, I didn't tell people that I worked there, and I didn't tell people what I really did, and I didn't tell people where I went. But later on, when the Soviet Union fell, it becomes more expensive to keep people undercover for lots of different reasons, and so I petitioned to become an open employee. And in the agency, about 80% of the people are open, about 20% are undercover, most of them operational people, which is what I had done. But I was told that I could become an open employee with a very limited description of what I could do, which basically says I worked on the security details of the CIA director. Mr. Casey was in charge while I was there during that time, Bill Casey. And it also says that I trained counterterrorism teams around the world to include presidential details. It is interesting that at the same time that I was there, not all the time, but part of the time, Bob Woodward wrote a book called Veil, The Secret Wars of the CIA, 1981 to 1987. It's called The Spy Story of the Century. And Bob Woodward was a very well-known journalist, an author, newspaper man to my generation. And so he quoted a lot of things from Mr. Casey here discussing what the agency was doing during those time frames of 81 to 87. So most of the time you'll hear me say, the book says, which I'm talking about this book, the book Veil, if I'm discussing CIA issues. The other book that I'll be discussing is the Bible, the other side of this equation. You know, that we have CIA, which is the political side, and the other side is God's plan. What's God's plan? And so right here is God's plan. And so we're going to be quoting things from the Bible to see what's God's plan. Not what man's plan is, but what is the truth. What's biblical truth. Because as I traveled to about 55 different countries, I soon found out that if you're just looking at man's plan, sometimes the truth can be a little murky and everything's not as black and white as I hoped it would be from the very beginning. So as you can see, there I am on the Khyber Pass. Obviously, the book says that the agency was supporting the Mujahideen to try to overthrow the Soviets. We provided training and eventually Stinger missiles, and we did drive the Soviets out, which at the time we thought we had conquered, as President Reagan would say, the evil empire. But historically, if we look back, the world, everything we do always has repercussions, and nothing really has changed. In all the places I've been, I just don't really see a lot of changes. I look back, which has led me to this point to kind of compare what God's plan to save the world is versus what man's plan to save the world. So I was an operations officer at the CIA, I just discussed. Prior to that, I was within CIS as a civilian special agent, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. When I was there from 82 to 84, it was NIS, Naval Investigative Service. The name changed. No one knew who that organization was until a TV show came out, NCIS. And then after my government service, I was director of global security at Ford Motor Company. And I was there for about 17 years, and I enjoyed my travel time there also, and got to see a lot of different countries, and to see just a civilian standpoint from a security aspect of traveling around the world. And prior to that, I was a polygraph examiner. After I graduated from the University of North Carolina, I decided I wanted to be a polygraph examiner because my dad was director of security for a large trucking company. And so he told me about the ability to do pre-employment polygraphs back during that time frame. In '77, you could go into stores and ask questions and actually like a background check, but they used a polygraph. You can no longer do that. But at the time, it was a very useful tool for a lot of different companies for doing quick background checks. And also, when we get to that point, I'll talk to you a little bit. It was my first encounter really with a person who was a devil worshiper. And she was a black witch. She worshiped evil. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. After I left Ford Motor Company, I decided that I wanted to be involved in the church, and I've always been active in the church, but I felt like that we hadn't reached as many people as I thought I would when I was traveling with the government. And we'll talk about that with the CIA. We hadn't influenced the world the way I thought we had. So it made me kind of reevaluate things, and so I went back to Liberty Baptist Theological Seminary, and I got a Master of Arts degree in Christian ministry and pastoral counseling. And so now that's what I spend my time doing, and I feel like God has led me to this point just to share some things with you. So as we go through here, we'll look at the presentation, and I'll give you an overview of CIA versus God, how we're going to save the world. And we'll talk about some general areas here. Before we do, though, I talk about how things get a little murky. Things are never quite as clear as you want them to be throughout this presentation. And this is a picture right here of President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan. They're visiting the Marines who were injured in the Beirut bombing of their barracks in 1983. And at the time, I was working with NIS, and I was traveling with the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And so there's a young Chris Hager standing right here in this picture, overseeing this thing as the president greets these people who were injured. So this was another interesting aspect in that the Marine barracks, the Marines were there in 1983 on a peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, but we had all kinds of factions there. We had the Hezbollah, we had the PLO, we had Iranians, we had Syrians, the same actors that we still have to this day that are involved with us. And they bombed the Marine Corps barracks, and they killed 241 Marines. And they also bombed a French barracks and killed 58 French soldiers. So as you look back on it now, I go, it's that same group. It's that same group of people. We really didn't do anything to save the world there. We thought we were. We went in with the military. And I want to say this right up front. We have the best military in the world. We are the strongest military in the world. We have helped more people than anybody in the world. But when we look back on some of the things that we've gotten involved in, whether it be Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Vietnam, we spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of lives. And sometimes we do make America safe in the short term, but in the long term, we never really saved the world. And that's what I want to talk about is, the long term. And so we're going to discuss in our presentation here, we're going to talk about the mission, the CIA mission versus God's mission. We're going to talk about the enemy, the CIA enemy versus God's enemy. And we're going to see that the CIA enemy is sometimes hard to decide who's your friend and who's your foe. And then the enemy is very easy to see that Satan is the enemy of God. And then we're going to talk about the battle plan, how man wants to go about saving the world and how he approaches those things. We're going to talk about the battle plan from God's standpoint, which is almost always going to be included in that Bible right there. We're going to talk about the various weapons that we use on both sides. The Bible's very clear. We're all familiar with them as we look about it in the paper of what's going on in the world. We'll talk about a CIA motto and a God motto that sometimes I used to follow as I was traveling around the world. And we'll look at our role as an ambassador, and a purpose that there is a CIA purpose for the ambassador, but God has a very specific purpose for the ambassador, and he lays it out very clearly in the Bible. And we'll talk about how you're going to be involved in that. And then I'll give you a practical application of something that I want to keep in your brain that saved my life. And we used to teach to counterterrorism teams around the world, and it works in the CIA plan, and it works in God's plan. And so we'll talk about that practical application. But I do think it's important that we talk about who wins, CIA versus God, but also who wins ultimately in this battle. And so as we go through this, I will talk about how sometimes I think the CIA is the best intelligence organization in the world, and that we've saved the United States on numerous occasions. But as I look back, I just don't see where we changed or influenced the world, because everything really seems to regenerate itself. But I do want us to know as Christians, in the end, this battle, CIA versus God, God's going to win the battle. Ultimately, we are going to win the battle over evil and over Satan. And we always have to keep that in mind. But right now, let's just look at how did we kind of get to this man, CIA versus God, and how do we really save the world? So what I'd like for you to do is look at this entrance to the CIA as we begin this presentation, CIA versus God, how to save the world. And this is the main lobby of the CIA when you walk in. And they have this giant emblem there as you're walking in, and it's on the floor. So as you're standing there, this is what you see walking in. And you can see this, the star here, all the points are coming into the center. So this is all the information of the world coming in right to that center location. Over here, you see the honor wall. And the honor wall is where officers of the CIA have been killed in the line of duty. And each star represents a death. There's about 138 stars there now. Sometimes when you look at the book, there's a little book right here that you can look down and it will tell you who that person is. Doesn't tell you what he was doing or where he was at most of the time. Lots of times, though, the stars have no names. And probably about 70% of these people are operations officers, which is what I was in the CIA. Because when you're an operations officer, you're not going to all the good places in the world. You're going to all the bad places, all the places that are falling apart, all the places where they're having coups, all the places where there's famine, civil war. Not going to the tourist locations. A big chance that something might happen to you at some of those locations. So this is the honor wall, and as you come around, this is where you come in and show your badge to get in. This is a statue of Wild Bill Donovan. He was the first general in charge of the Office of Strategic Services, and this is just a little thing saying a star saying this is where it generated the beginning of the agency. And Wild Bill Donovan was in charge of that, and it later became the CIA. But as we move around here on this wall, you're going to find something that you never expected. And it's going to be engraved in giant letters. And it's going to be a Bible verse right there on the wall. So you're standing there, you're looking in, you see the stars over on your right, you're standing on the emblem. You see the statue of the beginning, and then you look to your left, and then here's this big verse. About each letter is about 2 feet, 3 feet tall. I mean, it's huge. And it says, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And that's John 8:32. So some people say, how did that happen? How did that get there? Turns out that Allen Dulles, who was the first director of the CIA, his father was a Presbyterian preacher, And so when they were talking about building this building, that was one of the things that he wanted there. And lots of people quote this Bible verse, and lots of people believe in that Bible verse, but that Bible verse is very tricky. Because truth is what we're debating here. Society wants us to have a certain version of truth, but then the Bible has a biblical truth. And people want to tell us there is no biblical truth, but there is. It's here. It's very simple. All we have to do is read it. Take the time. Have faith. Know that this is God's rule. But when you're looking at the truth, sometimes you're not sure what really is the truth. And it gets a little tricky if you don't pay attention to the verse before it, which says, if we go back one verse, John 8:31, it says, to the Jews who had believed him, Jesus said, if you hold to my teachings, if you hold to the Christian teachings, you are really my disciples. And disciples means somebody who, after you become faithful, after you decide you want to be a Christian, that you will become more Christ-like. You want to develop that relationship with him. Once you have the Holy Spirit in your heart, you're going to become a disciple. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Most people don't know the truth. They'll try to make up their own truth, but they don't know the truth. So let's then kind of look at what I am going to talk about in this whole presentation. We kind of talked about the different chapters that we're going to look at. But overall, it started out with me going, what really is the problem here? And I thought the big problem, just to put it in a simplistic view, was good versus evil. And I'm representing good here. I'm representing the United States of America, a democratic society, a capitalist financial system, and Christian beliefs. That's what I'm representing. And then we had evil. And evil is one of those things we recognize when we see it sometimes, not always. And it was good versus evil. And so I felt like, we could have some impact on this. But when I looked at it, sometimes it became country versus country, because when I was first with the agency, everything was the Soviet Union. They were the evil empire, according to President Reagan. And we were trying to overthrow them. And I've been to Checkpoint Charlie, which was the dividing line of the East and the West. And you see how they treated their people, and you go, that was an evil empire. And I was fortunate that when the Soviet Union fell, I traveled to most of the little satellite nations that fell off from them, whether it be Romania or Czechoslovakia or Lithuania, all those little places. So I did believe, okay, it really is us against some of these other places. Iran, Syria. Some of the people, though, it turned out they were our friends. We thought Iraq, and then they weren't our friends. And some of the people now who claim to be our friends, Pakistan, are sometimes not our friends. They are housing terrorists. So then it comes down to, is it religion versus religion? Sometimes we get caught into that. And we go, is it us against Islam? Not really. Is it the Jews against Islam? Not really. But we start to believe that. But in actuality, lots of religions have persecuted each other. We've been fighting battles forever. Christianity and Islam has been fighting battles forever. Some of them ordained by the church. Sometimes you go to Islamic countries and it's Sunnis fighting Shia. They're killing each other over religion. So I believe religion plays in there for a factor, no doubt. But it's not the only factor. So then we come to tribe versus tribe. And tribe versus tribe is really the worst one. In that once you have a country where you become tribal, the will of the country is no longer to do what's best for the country, but only to concentrate on your little tribe, on what's best for your tribe. Then you'll end up with, that's the civil wars that we fight all the time around the world, and we continue to fight those. And sometimes we look at the country now and I go, oh my gosh, we're trying to break up into tribes. You know, the Democrats and the Republicans, we can't talk to each other anymore. I can't listen to you. But we have to listen to each other and start looking for some mutual biblical truths where we can meet together to say, we want what is best for our country. And we have to stay away from this tribe versus tribe. And then I go, okay, the democracy thing, we can solve that. Democracy, dictators, we see where in Russia we have Z and Putin, and Russia we have Putin, and in China we have Z. And you go, hi, the people don't get a chance to vote anywhere. Or if you do vote, it's not really an election. But you also find out that once you start looking at democracy versus dictators, that sometimes democracies are a little fragile there, in that people that you think are democratic, and we used to support Mobutu and Zaire, but in actuality, nobody ever ran against him. If they did, they disappeared. And then you go, oh, little murky here. Zia in Pakistan. You know, we support him, and then he gets assassinated, but nobody really voted against him, and it wasn't as clear as I thought it was going to be. And then the capitalism versus communism, other isms. Capitalism is the best system in the world. When you go to these other places, you will see that the other systems don't work. I've stood in food lines in Lithuania, and when you get there, the only thing you can get is just a slice of bologna, a piece of cheese, and some old bread, and a rusty can of vegetables. And that's what people do every day. The system doesn't work for the people. And when you get there, you see it. You see how poor they are. You see how beaten they are. You see how downtrodden they are. And you're amazed sometimes when you just go to countries where the people, there is no light. And we will always be the light. We'll talk about being a liberty, a beacon of liberty. But we are the light and a beacon of liberty.